The Octopus by Frank Norris. This book consists of 15 chapters and is 438 pages long. The following material appears on the dust jacket of the book. Etched in sharp, pitiless detail, here is the 19th century's historic clash between the men who grew the wheat that made America rich and strong, and the ruthless, power-hungry railroads, thrusting their steel tentacles relentlessly across the fertile California valleys. Frank Norris's The Octopus is America's first big novel of social protest, a milestone in modern realism. Frank Norris was born in Chicago in 1870 and grew up in San Francisco. As a student at the University of California, he discovered Zola's writings. Deeply under the influence of this great French realist, Norris became a pioneer proponent of realism in America. His novels, McTeague, Vandover and the Brute, The Pit, and The Octopus won him wide critical recognition in his lifetime and enduring fame. Shortly before his tragic death at the age of 32, Norris wrote of his work, "I never truckled. I never took off the hat to fashion and held it out for pennies. I told them the truth. They liked it or they didn't like it. What had that to do with me? I told them the truth." Dedicated to my wife. Book 1, Chapter 1. Just after passing Caraher's saloon on the county road that ran south from Bonneville and that divided the Broderson Ranch from that of Los Muertos, Presley was suddenly aware of the faint and prolonged blowing of a steam whistle that he knew must come from the railroad shops near the depot at Bonneville. In starting out from the ranch house that morning, he had forgotten his watch and was now perplexed to know whether the whistle was blowing for 12 or for 1 o'clock. He hoped the former. Early that morning he had decided to make a long excursion through the neighboring country, partly on foot and partly on his bicycle, and now noon was come already, and as yet he had hardly started. As he was leaving the house after breakfast, Mrs. Derrick had asked him to go for the mail at Bonneville, and he had not been able to refuse. He took a firmer hold of the cork grips of his handlebars, the road being in a wretched condition after the recent hauling of the crop, and quickened his pace. He told himself that, no matter what the time was, he would not stop for luncheon at the ranch house, but would push on to Guadalajara and have a Spanish dinner at Solotari's, as he had originally planned. There had not been much of a crop to haul that year. Half of the wheat on the Broderson Ranch had failed entirely, and Derrick himself had hardly raised more than enough to supply seed for the winter's sowing. But such little hauling as there had been had reduced the roads thereabouts to a lamentable condition, and during the dry season of the past few months the layer of dust had deepened and thickened to such an extent that more than once Presley was obliged to dismount and trudge along on foot, pushing his bicycle in front of him. It was the last half of September, the very end of the dry season, and all Tulare County, all the vast reaches of the San Joaquin Valley, in fact all south-central California, was bone dry, parched, and baked and crisped after 4 months of cloudless weather, when the day seemed always at noon, and the sun blazed white-hot over the valley from the Coast Range in the west to the foothills of the Sierras in the east. As Presley drew near to the point where what was known as the Lower Road struck off through the Rancho de los Muertos, leading on to Guadalajara, he came upon one of the county watering tanks, a great iron-hooped tower of wood, straddling clumsily on its 4 uprights by the roadside. Since the day of its completion, the storekeepers and retailers of Bonneville had painted their advertisements upon it. It was a landmark. In that reach of level fields, the white letters upon it could be read for miles. A watering trough stood nearby, and as he was very thirsty, Presley resolved to stop for a moment to get a drink. He drew abreast of the tank and halted there, leaning his bicycle against the fence. A couple of men in white overalls were repainting the surface of the tank, seated on swinging platforms that hung by hooks from the roof. They were painting a sign, an advertisement. It was all but finished, and read, S. Berman, Real Estate, Mortgages, Main Street, Bonneville, opposite the post office. On the horse trough that stood in the shadow of the tank was another freshly painted inscription. S. Berman has something to say to you. As Presley straightened up after drinking from the faucet at one end of the horse trough, the watering cart itself labored into view around the turn of the lower road. 2 mules and 2 horses, white with dust, strained leisurely in the traces, moving at a snail's pace, their limp ears marking the time. While perched high upon the seat, under a yellow cotton wagon umbrella, Presley recognized Hooven, one of Derek's tenants, a German whom everyone called Bismarck, an excitable little man with a perpetual grievance and an endless flow of broken English. "Hello, Bismarck," said Presley, as Hooven brought his team to a standstill by the tank, preparatory to refilling. "Yust der men I look for, Mr. Presley," cried the other, twisting the reins around the brake. "Just 1 minute, you wait, hey? I want to talk with you." Presley was impatient to be on his way again. A little more time wasted, and the day would be lost. He had nothing to do with the management of the ranch, and if Hooven wanted any advice from him, it was so much breath wasted. These uncouth brutes of farm hands and petty ranchers, grimed with the soil they worked upon, were odious to him beyond words. Never could he feel in sympathy with them, nor with their lives, their ways, their marriages, deaths, bickerings, and all the monotonous round of their sordid existence. "Well, you must be quick about it, Bismarck," he answered sharply. "I'm late for dinner as it is." "So now, 2 minuten and I be mit you." He drew down the overhanging spout of the tank to the vent in the circumference of the cart and pulled the chain that let out the water. Then he climbed down from the seat, jumping from the tire of the wheel, and, taking Presley by the arm, led him a few steps down the road. "Say," he began, "say, I want to have some conversations mit you. Just der men I want to see. Say, Caraher, he told me this morgen, say, he told me Mr. Derek gonna farm der whole dim ranch hisself der next year. No more tenants. Say, Caraher, he told me all der tenants get der sack. Mr. Derek gonna work der whole dim ranch hisself, hey? Me, I get der sack also, hey? You have hear about those ting? Say, me, I have on der ranch been 7 year. Do I also?" "You'll have to see Derek himself, or Harron, about that, Bismarck," interrupted Presley, trying to draw away. "That's something outside of me entirely." But Hooven was not to be put off. No doubt he had been meditating his speech all the morning, formulating his words, preparing his phrases. "Say, no," he continued. "Me, I want to stay by der place. 7 year I have stay. Mr. Derek, he don't want that I should be gesacked. Who then will der ditch getend? Say, you tell 'em Bismarck have got to sure stay by der place. Say, you have ter pull mit der governor, you speak der good word for me." "Harron is the man that has pull with his father, Bismarck," answered Presley. "You get Harron to speak for you, and you're all right." 7 year I have stay," protested Hooven. "And who will der ditch getend, and all of dem kettles drive?" "Well, Harron's your man," answered Presley, preparing to mount his bicycle. "Say, you have hear about those ting?" "I don't hear about anything, Bismarck. I don't know the first thing about how the ranch is run." "Und der pipeline gemend," Hooven burst out, suddenly remembering a forgotten argument. He waved an arm. "Ach, der pipeline by der Mission Creek, und der water hole for those kettles. Say, he don't do it himself, perhaps, I don't think." "Well, talk to Harron about it." "Say, he don't farm der whole dim ranch by hisself. Me, I gotta stay." But on a sudden the water in the cart gushed over the sides from the vent in the top with a smart sound of splashing. Hooven was forced to turn his attention to it. Presley got his wheel under way. "I have some conversations mit Harron," Hooven called after him. "He don't do it by hisself then, Mr. Derek. Ach, no, I stay by der ranch to drive those kettles." He climbed back to his seat under the wagon umbrella, and, as he started his team again with great cracks of his long whip, turned to the painter still at work upon the sign, and declared with some defiance, 7 year, yes, sir, 7 year I have been on this ranch. Get up, you mule, you hoop." Meanwhile, Presley had turned into the lower road. He was now on Derek's land, Division No. 1, or as it was called, the home ranch of the great Los Muertos Rancho. The road was better here, the dust laid after the passage of Hooven's watering cart, and in a few minutes he had come to the ranch house itself, with its white picket fence, its few flower beds, and grove of eucalyptus trees. On the lawn at the side of the house he saw Heron in the act of setting out the automatic sprinkler. In the shade of the house, by the porch, were 2 or 3 of the greyhounds, part of the pack that were used to hunt down jackrabbits, and Godfrey, Heron's prize deerhound. Presley wheeled up the driveway and met Heron by the horse block. Heron was Magnus Derrick's youngest son, a very well-looking young fellow of 23 or 25. He had the fine carriage that marked his father, and still further resembled him in that he had the Derrick nose, hawk-like and prominent, such as one sees in the later portraits of the Duke of Wellington. He was blond, and incessant exposure to the sun had, instead of tanning him brown, merely heightened the color of his cheeks. His yellow hair had a tendency to curl in a forward direction just in front of the ears. Beside him, Presley made the sharpest of contrasts. Presley seemed to have come of a mixed origin, appeared to have a nature more composite, a temperament more complex. Unlike Heron Derrick, he seemed more of a character than a type. The sun had browned his face till it was almost swarthy. His eyes were a dark brown, and his forehead was the forehead of the intellectual, wide and high, with a certain unmistakable life about it that argued education not only of himself, but of his people before him. The impression conveyed by his mouth and chin was that of a delicate and highly sensitive nature, the lips thin and loosely shut together, the chin small and rather receding. One guessed that Presley's refinement had been gained only by a certain loss of strength. One expected to find him nervous, introspective, to discover that his mental life was not at all the result of impressions and sensations that came to him from without, but rather of thoughts and reflections germinating from within. Though morbidly sensitive to changes in his physical surroundings, he would be slow to act upon such sensations which would not prove impulsive, not because he was sluggish, but because he was merely irresolute. It could be foreseen that morally he was of the sort who avoid evil through good taste, lack of decision, and want of opportunity. His temperament was that of the poet. When he told himself he had been thinking, he deceived himself. He had, on such occasions, been only brooding. Some 18 months before this time he had been threatened with consumption, and, taking advantage of a standing invitation on the part of Magnus Derrick, had come to stay in the dry, even climate of the San Joaquin for an indefinite length of time. He was 30 years old, and had graduated and post-graduated with high honors from an Eastern college, where he had devoted himself to a passionate study of literature, and more especially of poetry. It was his insatiable ambition to write verse. But up to this time his work had been fugitive, ephemeral, a note here and there, heard, appreciated, and forgotten. He was in search of a subject, something magnificent, he did not know exactly what, some vast, tremendous theme, heroic, terrible, to be unrolled in all the thundering progression of hexameters. But whatever he wrote, and in whatever fashion, Presley was determined that his poem should be of the West, that world's frontier of romance, where a new race, a new people, hardy, brave, and passionate, were building an empire, where the tumultuous life ran like fire from dawn to dark, and from dark to dawn again, primitive, brutal, honest, and without fear. Something, to his idea not much, had been done to catch at that life in passing, but its poet had not yet arisen. The few sporadic attempts, thus he told himself, had only touched the keynote. He strove for the diapason, the great song that should embrace in itself a whole epoch, a complete era, the voice of an entire people, wherein all people should be included. They and their legends, their folklore, their fightings, their loves and their lusts, their blunt, grim humor, their stoicism under stress, their adventures, their treasures found in a day and gambled in a night, their direct, crude speech, their generosity and cruelty, their heroism and bestiality, their religion and profanity, their self-sacrifice and obscenity, a true and fearless setting forth of a passing phase of history, uncompromising, sincere. Each group in its proper environment, the valley, the plain, and the mountain, the ranch, the range, and the mine, all this, all the traits and types of every community from the Dakotas to the Mexicos, from Winnipeg to Guadalupe, gathered together, swept together, welded and riven together in one single mighty song, the song of the West. That was what he dreamed, while things without names, thoughts for which no man had yet invented words, terrible formless shapes, vague figures, colossal, monstrous, distorted, whirled at a gallop through his imagination. As Harron came by, Presley reached down into the pouches of the sun-bleached shooting coat he wore and drew out and handed him the packet of letters and papers. "Here's the mail. I think I shall go on." "But dinner is ready," said Harron. "We are just sitting down." Presley shook his head. "No, I'm in a hurry. Perhaps I shall have something to eat at Guadalajara. I shall be gone all day." He delayed a few moments longer, tightening a loose nut on his forward wheel, while Harron, recognizing his father's handwriting on one of the envelopes, slit it open and cast his eye rapidly over its pages. "The governor is coming home," he exclaimed, "tomorrow morning on the early train. Wants me to meet him with the team at Guadalajara. And," he cried between his clenched teeth as he continued to read, "we've lost the case." "What case? Oh, in the matter of rates?" Harron nodded, his eyes flashing, his face growing suddenly scarlet. "Alstein gave his decision yesterday," he continued, reading from his father's letter. "He holds, Alstein does, that grain rates as low as the new figure would amount to confiscation of property, and that on such a basis the railroad could not be operated at a legitimate profit. As he is powerless to legislate in the matter, he can only put the rates back at what they originally were, before the commissioners made the cut, and it is so ordered." "That's our friend S. Behrman again," added Harron, grinding his teeth. "He was up in the city the whole of the time the new schedule was being drawn, and he and Alstein and the Railroad Commission were as thick as thieves. He has been up there all this last week, too, doing the railroad's dirty work and backing Alstein up. Legitimate profit, he broke out. Can we raise wheat at a legitimate profit with a tariff of $4 a ton for moving it 200 miles to Tidewater with wheat at 87 cents? Why not hold us up with a gun in our faces and say, 'Hands up,' and be done with it?" He dug his boot heel into the ground and turned away to the house abruptly, cursing beneath his breath. "By the way," Presley called after him, "Hooven wants to see you. He asked me about this idea of the governor's of getting along without the tenants this year. Hooven wants to stay to tend the ditch and look after the stock. I told him to see you." Harron, his mind full of other things, nodded to say he understood. Presley only waited till he had disappeared indoors so that he might not seem too indifferent to his trouble. Then, remounting, struck at once into a brisk pace, and turning out from the carriage gate, held on swiftly down the lower road, going in the direction of Guadalajara. These matters, these eternal fierce bickerings between the farmers of the San Joaquin and the Pacific and Southwestern Railroad, irritated him and wearied him. He cared for none of these things. They did not belong to his world. In the picture of that huge romantic West that he saw in his imagination, these dissensions made the one note of harsh color that refused to enter into the great scheme of harmony. It was material, sordid, deadly commonplace. But however he strove to shut his eyes to it or his ears to it, the thing persisted and persisted. The romance seemed complete up to that point. There it broke, there it failed, there it became realism, grim, unlovely, unyielding. To be true, and it was the first article of his creed to be unflinchingly true, he could not ignore it. All the noble poetry of the ranch, the valley, seemed in his mind to be marred and disfigured by the presence of certain immovable facts. Just what he wanted, Presley hardly knew. On one hand, it was his ambition to portray life as he saw it, directly, frankly, and through no medium of personality or temperament. But on the other hand, as well, he wished to see everything through a rose-colored mist, a mist that dulled all harsh outlines, all crude and violent colors. He told himself that, as part of the people, he loved the people and sympathized with their hopes and fears and joys and griefs. And yet Hooven, grimy and perspiring, with his perpetual grievance and his contracted horizon, only revolted him. He had set himself the task of giving true, absolutely true, poetical expression to the life of the ranch. And yet again and again he brought up against the railroad, that stubborn iron barrier against which his romance shattered itself to froth and disintegrated, flying spume. His heart went out to the people, and his groping hand met that of a slovenly little Dutchman whom it was impossible to consider seriously. He searched for the true romance, and in the end found grain rates and unjust freight tariffs. "But the stuff is here," he muttered, as he sent his wheel rumbling across the bridge over Broderson Creek. "The romance, the real romance, is here somewhere. I'll get hold of it yet." He shot a glance about him as if in search of the inspiration. By now he was not quite halfway across the northern and narrowest corner of Los Muertos, at this point some 8 miles wide. He was still on the home ranch. A few miles to the south he could just make out the line of wire fence that separated it from the 3rd Division, and to the north, seen faint and blue through the haze and shimmer of the noon sun, a long file of telegraph poles showed the line of the railroad and marked Derrick's northeast boundary. The road over which Presley was traveling ran almost diametrically straight. In front of him, but at a great distance, he could make out the giant live oak and the red roof of Hooven's barn that stood near it. All about him the country was flat. In all directions he could see for miles. The harvest was just over. Nothing but stubble remained on the ground. With the one exception of the live oak by Hooven's place, there was nothing green in sight. The wheat stubble was of a dirty yellow, the ground, parched, cracked, and dry, of a cheerless brown. By the roadside the dust lay thick and gray, and on either hand, stretching on toward the horizon, losing itself in a mere smudge in the distance, ran the illimitable parallels of the wire fence. And that was all, that and the burnt-out blue of the sky and the steady shimmer of the heat. The silence was infinite. After the harvest, small though that harvest had been, the ranches seemed asleep. It was as though the earth, after its period of reproduction, its pains of labor, had been delivered of the fruit of its loins, and now slept the sleep of exhaustion. It was the period between seasons, when nothing was being done, when the natural forces seemed to hang suspended. There was no rain, there was no wind, there was no growth, no life. The very stubble had no force even to rot. The sun alone moved. Toward 2 o'clock, Presley reached Hooven's place, 2 or 3 grimy frame buildings infested with a swarm of dogs. A hog or two wandered aimlessly about. Under a shed by the barn, a broken-down cedar lay rusting to its ruin. But overhead, a mammoth live oak, the largest tree in all the countryside, towered, superb and magnificent. Gray bunches of mistletoe and festoons of trailing moss hung from its bark. From its lowest branch hung Hooven's meat safe, a square box faced with wire screens. What gave a special interest to Hooven's was the fact that here was the intersection of the lower road and Derrick's main irrigating ditch, a vast trench not yet completed, which he and Annixter, who worked the Quien ranch, were jointly constructing. It ran directly across the road and at right angles to it, and lay a deep groove in the field between Hooven's and the town of Guadalajara, some 3 miles farther on. Besides this, the ditch was a natural boundary between 2 divisions of the Los Muertos ranch, the 1st and 4th. Presley now had the choice of 2 routes. His objective point was the spring at the headwaters of Broderson Creek in the hills on the eastern side of the Quien ranch. The trail afforded him a short cut thitherward. As he passed the house, Mrs. Hooven came to the door, her little daughter, Hilda, dressed in a boy's overalls and clumsy boots, at her skirts. Minna, her oldest daughter, a very pretty girl whose love affairs were continually the talk of all Los Muertos, was visible through a window of the house, busy at the week's washing. Mrs. Hooven was a faded, colorless woman, middle-aged and commonplace, and offering not the least characteristic that would distinguish her from 1,000 other women of her class and kind. She nodded to Presley, watching him with a stolid gaze from under her arm, which she held across her forehead to shade her eyes. But now Presley exerted himself in good earnest. His bicycle flew. He resolved that after all he would go to Guadalajara. He crossed the bridge over the irrigating ditch with a brusque spurt of hollow sound and shot forward down the last stretch of the lower road that yet intervened between Hooven's and the town. He was on the 4th Division of the ranch now, the only one whereon the wheat had been successful, no doubt because of the little Mission Creek that ran through it. But he no longer occupied himself with the landscape. His only concern was to get on as fast as possible. He had looked forward to spending nearly the whole day on the crest of the wooded hills in the northern corner of the Quien-Sabe ranch, reading, idling, smoking his pipe. But now he would do well if he arrived there by the middle of the afternoon. In a few moments he had reached the line fence that marked the limits of the ranch. Here were the railroad tracks. Just beyond, a huddled mass of roofs with here and there an adobe house on its outskirts, the little town of Guadalajara. Nearer at hand, and directly in front of Presley, were the freight and passenger depots of the Pacific and Southwestern, painted in the gray and white which seemed to be the official colors of all the buildings owned by the corporation. The station was deserted. No trains passed at this hour. From the direction of the ticket window, Presley heard the unsteady chittering of the telegraph key. In the shadow of one of the baggage trucks upon the platform, the great yellow cat that belonged to the agent dozed complacently, her paws tucked under her body. 3 flat cars, loaded with bright-painted farming machines, were on the siding above the station, while on the switch below, a huge freight engine that lacked its cowcatcher sat back upon its monstrous driving wheels, motionless, solid, drawing long breaths that were punctuated by the subdued sound of its steam pump clicking at exact intervals. But evidently it had been decreed that Presley should be stopped at every point of his ride that day, for as he was pushing his bicycle across the tracks, he was surprised to hear his name called. "Hello there, Mr. Presley. What's the good word?" Presley looked up quickly and saw Dyke, the engineer, leaning on his folded arms from the cab window of the freight engine. But at the prospect of this further delay, Presley was less troubled. Dyke and he were well acquainted and the best of friends. The picturesqueness of the engineer's life was always attractive to Presley, and more than once he had ridden on Dyke's engine between Guadalajara and Bonneville. Once, even, he had made the entire run between the latter town and San Francisco in the cab. Dyke's home was in Guadalajara. He lived in one of the remodeled adobe cottages where his mother kept house for him. His wife had died some 5 years before this time, leaving him a little daughter, Sydney, to bring up as best he could. Dyke himself was a heavy-built, well-looking fellow, nearly twice the weight of Presley, with great shoulders and massive, hairy arms, and a tremendous rumbling voice. "Hello, old man," answered Presley, coming up to the engine. "What are you doing about here at this time of day? I thought you were on the night service this month." "We've changed about a bit," answered the other. "Come up here and sit down and get out of the sun. They've held us here to wait orders," he explained, as Presley, after leaning his bicycle against the tender, climbed to the fireman's seat of worn green leather. "They are changing the run of one of the crack passenger engines down below, and are sending her up to Fresno. There was a smash of some kind on the Bakersfield division, and she's to hell and gone behind her time. I suppose when she comes, she'll come a-humming. It will be stand clear and an open track all the way to Fresno. They have held me here to let her go by." He took his pipe, an old T.D. clay, but colored to a beautiful shiny black, from the pocket of his jumper, and filled and lit it. "Well, I don't suppose you object to being held here," observed Presley. "Gives you a chance to visit your mother and the little girl." "And precisely they choose this day to go up to Sacramento," answered Dyke. "Just my luck. Went up to visit my brother's people. By the way, my brother may come down here, locate here, I mean, and go into the hop-raising business. He's got an option on 500 acres just back of the town here. He says there's going to be money in hops. I don't know. Maybe I'll go in with him." "Why, what's the matter with railroading?" Dyke drew a couple of puffs on his pipe and fixed Presley with a glance. "There's this the matter with it," he said. "I'm fired." "Fired? You?" exclaimed Presley, turning abruptly toward him. "That's what I'm telling you," returned Dyke grimly. "You don't mean it. Why, what for, Dyke?" "Now, you tell me what for," growled the other savagely. "Boy and man, I've worked for the P&SW for over 10 years, and never one yelp of a complaint did I ever hear from them. They know damn well they've not got a steadier man on the road. And more than that, I don't belong to the Brotherhood. And when the strike came along, I stood by them, stood by the company. You know that. And you know, and they know, that at Sacramento that time I ran my train according to schedule, with a gun in each hand, never knowing when I was going over a mined culvert, and there was talk of giving me a gold watch at the time. To hell with their gold watches. I want ordinary justice and fair treatment. And now, when hard times come along, and they are cutting wages, what do? Do they make any discrimination in my case? Do they remember the man that stood by them and risked his life in their service? No. They cut my pay down just as offhand as they do the pay of any dirty little wiper in the yard. Cut me along with, listen to this, cut me along with men that they had blacklisted, strikers that they took back because they were short of hands. He drew fiercely on his pipe. I went to them, yes, I did. I went to the general office and ate dirt. I told them I was a family man, and that I didn't see how I was going to get along on the new scale, and I reminded them of my service during the strike. The swine told me that it wouldn't be fair to discriminate in favor of one man, and that the cut must apply to all their employees alike. Fair, he shouted with laughter. Fair. Hear the P&SW talking about fairness and discrimination? That's good, that is. Well, I got furious. I was a fool, I suppose. I told them that, in justice to myself, I wouldn't do first-class work for third-class pay. And they said, well, Mr. Dyke, you know what you can do. Well, I did know. I said, I'll ask for my time, if you please, and they gave it to me just as if they were glad to be shut of me. So there you are, Presley. That's the P&SW Railroad Company of California. I am on my last run now. Shameful, declared Presley, his sympathies all aroused, now that the trouble concerned a friend of his. It's shameful, Dyke. But, he added, an idea occurring to him, that don't shut you out from work. There are other railroads in the state that are not controlled by the P&SW. Dyke smote his knee with his clenched fist. Name one. Presley was silent. Dyke's challenge was unanswerable. There was a lapse in their talk. Presley drumming on the arm of the seat, meditating on this injustice, Dyke looking off over the fields beyond the town, his frown lowering, his teeth rasping upon the pipe-stem. The station agent came to the door of the depot, stretching and yawning. On ahead of the engine, the empty rails of the track, reaching out toward the horizon, threw off visible layers of heat. The telegraph key clicked incessantly. So I'm going to quit, Dyke remarked after a while, his anger somewhat subsided. My brother and I will take up this hop ranch. I've saved a good deal in the last 10 years, and there ought to be money in hops. Presley went on, remounting his bicycle, wheeling silently through the deserted streets of the decayed and dying Mexican town. It was the hour of the siesta. Nobody was about. There was no business in the town. It was too close to Bonneville for that. Before the railroad came, and in the days when the raising of cattle was the great industry of the country, it had enjoyed a fierce and brilliant life. Now it was moribund. The drugstore, the 2 bar rooms, the hotel at the corner of the old plaza, and the shops where Mexican curios were sold to those occasional Eastern tourists who came to visit the mission of San Juan, sufficed for the town's activity. At Solotari's, the restaurant on the plaza, diagonally across from the hotel, Presley ate his long-deferred Mexican dinner, an omelet in Spanish-Mexican style, frijoles and tortillas, a salad, and a glass of white wine. In a corner of the room, during the whole course of his dinner, 2 young Mexicans, one of whom was astonishingly handsome, after the melodramatic fashion of his race, and an old fellow, the centenarian of the town, decrepit beyond belief, sang an interminable love song to the accompaniment of a guitar and an accordion. These Spanish Mexicans, decayed, picturesque, vicious, and romantic, never failed to interest Presley. A few of them still remained in Guadalajara, drifting from the saloon to the restaurant, and from the restaurant to the plaza, relics of a former generation, standing for a different order of things, absolutely idle, living God knew how, happy with their cigarette, their guitar, their glass of mezcal, and their siesta. The centenarian remembered Fremont and Governor Alvarado and the bandit Jesus Tejeda, and the days when Los Muertos was a Spanish grant, a veritable principality, leagues in extent, and when there was never a fence from Visalia to Fresno. Upon this occasion Presley offered the old man a drink of mezcal and excited him to talk of the things he remembered. Their talk was in Spanish, a language with which Presley was familiar. De la Cuesta held the grant of Los Muertos in those days, the centenarian said, a grand man. He had the power of life and death over his people, and there was no law but his word. There was no thought of wheat then, you may believe. It was all cattle in those days, sheep, horses, steers, not so many, and if money was scarce, there was always plenty to eat, and clothes enough for all, and wine, ah, yes, by the vat, and oil, too. The mission fathers had that. Yes, and there was wheat as well, now that I come to think, but a very little, in the fields north of the mission, where now it is the seed ranch. Wheat fields were there, and also a vineyard, all on mission grounds. Wheat, olives, and the vine. The fathers planted those to provide the elements of the Holy Sacrament, bread, oil, and wine, you understand. It was like that. Those industries began in California, from the church. And now, he put his chin in the air, what would Father Olivari have said to such a crop as Senor Derrick plants these days? 10,000 acres of wheat. Nothing but wheat from the Sierra to the Coast Range. I remember when De la Cuesta was married. He had never seen the young lady, only her miniature portrait, painted. He raised a shoulder, I do not know by whom, small, a little thing to be held in the palm. But he fell in love with that, and marry her he would. The affair was arranged between him and the girl's parents. But when the time came that De la Cuesta was to go to Monterey to meet and marry the girl, behold, Jesus Tejeda broke in upon the small rancheros near Terabella. It was no time for De la Cuesta to be away. So he sent his brother Esteban to Monterey to marry the girl by proxy for him. I went with Esteban. We were a company, nearly 100 men, and De la Cuesta sent a horse for the girl to ride, white, pure white, and the saddle was of red leather. The headstall, the bit and buckles, all the metalwork of virgin silver. Well, there was a ceremony in the Monterey mission, and Esteban, in the name of his brother, was married to the girl. On our way back, De la Cuesta rode out to meet us. His company met ours at Agatha dos Palos. Never will I forget De la Cuesta's face as his eyes fell upon the girl. It was a look, a glance, come and gone like that. He snapped his fingers. No one but I saw it, but I was close by. There was no mistaking that look. De la Cuesta was disappointed. And the girl? Demanded Presley. She never knew. Ah, he was a grand gentleman, De la Cuesta. Always he treated her as a queen. Never was husband more devoted, more respectful, more chivalrous. But love? The old fellow put his chin in the air, shutting his eyes in a knowing fashion. It was not there, I could tell. They were married over again at the Mission San Juan de Guadalajara, our mission, and for a week all the town of Guadalajara was in fete. There were bullfights in the plaza, this very one, for 5 days, and to each of his tenants-in-chief De la Cuesta gave a horse, a barrel of tallow, an ounce of silver, and half an ounce of gold dust. Ah, those were days. That was a gay life. This, he made a comprehensive gesture with his left hand, this is stupid. You may well say that, observed Presley moodily, discouraged by the other's talk. All his doubts and uncertainty had returned to him. Never would he grasp the subject of his great poem. Today the life was colorless. Romance was dead. He had lived too late. To write of the past was not what he desired. Reality was what he longed for, things that he had seen. Yet how to make this compatible with romance? He rose, putting on his hat, offering the old man a cigarette. The centenarian accepted with the air of a grandee, and extended his horn snuff-box. Presley shook his head. "I was born too late for that," he declared. "For that, and for many other things. Adios." "You are traveling today, senor?" "A little turn through the country to get the kinks out of the muscles," Presley answered. "I go up into the Quien Sabe, into the high country beyond the mission." "Ah, the Quien Sabe rancho. The sheep are grazing there this week." Solotari, the keeper of the restaurant, explained. "Young Annixter sold his wheat stubble on the ground to the sheep raisers off yonder." He motioned eastward toward the Sierra foothills. "Since Sunday the herd has been down. Very clever, that young Annixter. He gets a price for his stubble, which else he would have to burn, and also manures his land as the sheep move from place to place. A true Yankee, that Annixter, a good gringo." After his meal, Presley once more mounted his bicycle, and leaving the restaurant and the plaza behind him, held on through the main street of the drowsing town, the street that farther on developed into the road which turned abruptly northward and led onward through the hop fields and the Quien Sabe ranch toward the mission of San Juan. The home ranch of the Quien Sabe was in the little triangle bounded on the south by the railroad, on the northwest by Broderson Creek, and on the east by the hop fields and the mission lands. It was traversed in all directions, now by the trail from Hooven's, now by the irrigating ditch, the same which Presley had crossed earlier in the day, and again by the road upon which Presley then found himself. In its center were Annixter's ranch house and barns, topped by the skeleton-like tower of the artesian well that was to feed the irrigating ditch. Farther on, the course of Broderson Creek was marked by a curved line of gray-green willows, while on the low hills to the north, as Presley advanced, the ancient mission of San Juan de Guadalajara, with its belfry tower and red-tiled roof, began to show itself over the crests of the venerable pear trees that clustered in its garden. When Presley reached Annixter's ranch house, he found young Annixter himself stretched in his hammock behind the mosquito bar on the front porch, reading David Copperfield and gorging himself with dried prunes. Annixter, after the two had exchanged greetings, complained of terrific colics all the preceding night. His stomach was out of whack, but you bet he knew how to take care of himself. The last spell he had consulted a doctor at Bonneville, a gibbering, busy face who had filled him up to the neck with a dose of some hogwash stuff that had made him worse. A healthy lot the doctors knew anyhow. His case was peculiar. He knew. Prunes were what he needed, and by the pound. Annixter, who worked the Quien Sabe ranch, some 4,000 acres of rich clay and heavy loams, was a very young man, younger even than Presley, like him a college graduate. He never looked a year older than he was. He was smooth-shaven and lean-built, but his youthful appearance was offset by a certain male cast of countenance, the lower lip thrust out, the chin large and deeply cleft. He was smooth-shaven and lean-built, but his youthful appearance was offset by a certain male cast of countenance, the lower lip thrust out, the chin large and deeply cleft. His university course had hardened rather than polished him. He still remained one of the people, rough almost to insolence, direct in speech, intolerant in his opinions, relying upon absolutely no one but himself. Yet, with all this, of an astonishing degree of intelligence, and possessed of an executive ability little short of positive genius. He was a ferocious worker, allowing himself no pleasures, and exacting the same degree of energy from all his subordinates. He was widely hated, and as widely trusted. Everyone spoke of his crusty temper and bullying disposition, invariably qualifying the statement with a commendation of his resources and capabilities. The devil of a driver, a hard man to get along with, obstinate, contrary, cantankerous, but brains, no doubt of that, brains to his boots. One would like to see the man who could get ahead of him on a deal. Twice he had been shot at, once from ambush on Osterman's ranch, and once by one of his own men, whom he had kicked from the sacking platform of his harvester for gross negligence. At college, he had specialized in finance, political economy, and scientific agriculture. After his graduation, He stood almost at the very top of his class. He had returned and obtained the degree of civil engineer. Then suddenly he had taken a notion that a practical knowledge of law was indispensable to a modern farmer. In 8 months he did the work of 3 years, studying for his bar examinations. His method of study was characteristic. He reduced all the material of his textbooks to notes. Tearing out the leaves of these notebooks, he pasted them upon the walls of his room. Then, in his shirt-sleeves, a cheap cigar in his teeth, his hands in his pockets, he walked around and around the room, scowling fiercely at his notes, memorizing, devouring, digesting. At intervals he drank great cupfuls of unsweetened black coffee. When the bar examinations were held, he was admitted at the very head of all the applicants, and was complimented by the judge. Immediately afterwards he collapsed with nervous prostration, his stomach got out of whack, and he all but died in a Sacramento boarding-house, obstinately refusing to have anything to do with doctors, whom he vituperated as a rabble of quacks, dosing himself with a patent medicine, and stuffing himself almost to bursting with liver pills and dried prunes. He had taken a trip to Europe after this sickness to put himself completely to rights. He intended to be gone a year, but returned at the end of 6 weeks, fulminating abuse of European cooking. Nearly his entire time had been spent in Paris, but of this sojourn he had brought back but 2 souvenirs, an electroplated bill-hook and an empty bird-cage which had tickled his fancy immensely. He was wealthy. Only a year previous to this, his father, a widower who had amassed a fortune in land speculation, had died, and Annixter, the only son, had come into the inheritance. For Presley, Annixter professed a great admiration, holding in deep respect the man who could rhyme words, deferring to him whenever there was a question of literature or works of fiction. No doubt there was not much use in poetry, and as for novels, to his mind, there were only Dickens' works. Everything else was a lot of lies. But just the same, it took brains to grind out a poem. It wasn't everyone who could rhyme brave and glaive and make sense out of it. Sure not. But Presley's case was a notable exception. On no occasion was Annixter prepared to accept another man's opinion without reserve. In conversation with him, it was almost impossible to make any direct statement, however trivial, that he would accept without either modification or open contradiction. He had a passion for violent discussion. He would argue upon every subject in the range of human knowledge, from astronomy to the tariff, from the doctrine of predestination to the height of a horse. Never would he admit himself to be mistaken. When cornered, he would entrench himself behind the remark, "Yes, that's all very well. In some ways it is, and then again, in some ways it isn't." Singularly enough, he and Presley were the best of friends. More than once, Presley marveled at this state of affairs, telling himself that he and Annixter had nothing in common. In all his circle of acquaintances, Presley was the one man with whom Annixter had never quarreled. The 2 men were diametrically opposed in temperament. Presley was easy-going, Annixter alert. Presley was a confirmed dreamer, irresolute, inactive, with a strong tendency to melancholy. The young farmer was a man of affairs, decisive, combative, whose only reflection upon his interior economy was a morbid concern in the vagaries of his stomach. Yet the 2 never met without a mutual pleasure, taking a genuine interest in each other's affairs, and often putting themselves to great inconvenience to be of trifling service to help one another. As a last characteristic, Annixter pretended to be a woman-hater, for no other reason than that he was a very bull-calf of awkwardness in feminine surroundings. Females, rot. There was a fine way for a man to waste his time and his good money, lollygagging with a lot of females. No, thank you, none of it in his, if you please. Once only he had an affair, a timid little creature in a glove-cleaning establishment in Sacramento, whom he had picked up, heaven knew how. After his return to his ranch, a correspondence had been maintained between the 2, Annixter taking the precaution to typewrite his letters, and never affixing his signature in an excess of prudence. He furthermore made carbon copies of all his letters, filing them away in a compartment of his safe. It would be a clever female who would get him into a mess. Then, suddenly smitten with a panic terror that he had committed himself, that he was involving himself too deeply, he had abruptly sent the little woman about her business. It was his only love affair. After that he kept himself free. No petticoats should ever have a hold on him, sure not. As Presley came up to the edge of the porch, pushing his bicycle in front of him, Annixter excused himself for not getting up, alleging that the cramps returned the moment he was off his back. "What are you doing up this way?" he demanded. "Oh, just having a look around," answered Presley. "How's the ranch?" "Say," observed the other, ignoring his question, "what's this I hear about Derek giving his tenants the bounce, and working Los Muertos himself, working all his land?" Presley made a sharp movement of impatience with his free hand. "I've heard nothing else myself since morning. I suppose it must be so." "Huh," grunted Annixter, spitting out a prune stone. "You give Magnus Derrick my compliments, and tell him he's a fool." "What do you mean?" "I suppose Derrick thinks he's still running his mine, and that the same principles will apply to getting grain out of the earth as to getting gold. Oh, let him go on and see where he brings up. That's right, there's your Western farmer," he exclaimed contemptuously. "Get the guts out of your land. Work it to death. Never give it a rest. Never alternate your crop, and then when your soil is exhausted, sit down and roar about hard times." "I suppose Magnus thinks the land has had rest enough these last 2 dry seasons," observed Presley. "He has raised no crop to speak of for 2 years. The land has had a good rest." Yes, that sounds well," Annixter contradicted, unwilling to be convinced. "In a way the land's been rested, and then, again, in a way it hasn't." But Presley, scenting an argument, refrained from answering, and bethought himself of moving on. "I'm going to leave my wheel here for a while, Buck," he said, "if you don't mind. I'm going up to the spring, and the road is rough between here and there." "Stop in for dinner on your way back," said Annixter. "There'll be a venison steak. One of the boys got a deer over in the foothills last week. Out of season, but never mind that. I can't eat it. This stomach of mine won't digest sweet oil today. Get here about 6. "Well, maybe I will, thank you," said Presley, moving off. "By the way," he added, "I see your barn is about done." "You bet," answered Annixter. "In about a fortnight now she'll be all ready." "It's a big barn," murmured Presley, glancing around the angle of the house toward where the great structure stood. "Guess we'll have to have a dance there before we move the stock in," observed Annixter. "That's the custom all around here." Presley took himself off, but at the gate Annixter called after him, his mouth full of prunes, "Say, take a look at that herd of sheep as you go up. They are right off here to the east of the road, about half a mile from here. I guess that's the biggest lot of sheep you ever saw. You might write a poem about 'em. Lamb, ram, sheep graze, sunny days. Catch on?" Beyond Broderson Creek, as Presley advanced, tramping along on foot now, the land opened out again into the same vast spaces of dull brown earth, sprinkled with stubble, such as had been characteristic of Derrick's ranch. To the east the reach seemed infinite, flat, cheerless, heat-ridden, unrolling like a gigantic scroll toward the faint shimmer of the distant horizons, with here and there an isolated live oak to break the somber monotony. But bordering the road to the westward, the surface roughened and raised, clambering up to the higher ground, on the crest of which the old mission and its surrounding pear trees were now plainly visible. Just beyond the mission the road bent abruptly eastward, striking off across the Seed Ranch. But Presley left the road at this point, going on across the open fields. There was no longer any trail. It was toward 3 o'clock. The sun still spun, a silent blazing disk high in the heavens, and tramping through the clods of uneven, broken plow was fatiguing work. The slope of the lowest foothills begun, the surface of the country became rolling, and suddenly, as he topped a higher ridge, Presley came upon the sheep. Already he had passed the larger part of the herd, an intervening rise of ground having hidden it from sight. Now, as he turned halfway about, looking down into the shallow hollow between him and the curve of the creek, he saw them very plainly. The fringe of the herd was some 200 yards distant, but its farther side, in that elusive shimmer of hot surface air, seemed miles away. The sheep were spread out roughly in the shape of a figure 8, two larger herds connected by a smaller, and were headed to the southward, moving slowly, grazing on the wheat stubble as they proceeded. But the number seemed incalculable. Hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of gray, rounded backs, all exactly alike, huddled, close-packed, alive, hid the earth from sight. It was no longer an aggregate of individuals. It was a mass, a compact, solid, slowly moving mass, huge without form, like a thick-pressed growth of mushrooms spreading out in all directions over the earth. From it there arose a vague murmur, confused, inarticulate, like the sound of very distant surf, while all the air in the vicinity was heavy with the warm, ammoniacal odor of the thousands of crowding bodies. All the colors of the scene were somber, the brown of the earth, the faded yellow of the dead stubble, the gray of the myriad of undulating backs. Only on the far side of the herd, erect, motionless, a single note of black, a speck, a dot. The shepherd stood, leaning upon an empty water trough, solitary, grave, impressive. For a few moments Presley stood watching. Then, as he started to move on, a curious thing occurred. At first he thought he had heard someone call his name. He paused, listening. There was no sound but the vague noise of the moving sheep. Then, as his first impression passed, it seemed to him that he had been beckoned to. Yet nothing stirred. Except for the lonely figure beyond the herd, there was no one in sight. He started on again, and in half a dozen steps found himself looking over his shoulder. Without knowing why, he looked toward the shepherd, then halted and looked a second time and a third. Had the shepherd called to him? Presley knew that he had heard no voice. Brusquely, all his attention seemed riveted upon this distant figure. He put one forearm over his eyes to keep off the sun, gazing across the intervening herd. Surely the shepherd had called him. But at the next instant he started, uttering an exclamation under his breath. The faraway speck of black became animated. Presley remarked a sweeping gesture. Though the man had not beckoned to him before, there was no doubt that he was beckoning now. Without any hesitation, and singularly interested in the incident, Presley turned sharply aside and hurried on toward the shepherd, skirting the herd, wondering all the time that he should answer the call with so little question, so little hesitation. But the shepherd came forward to meet Presley, followed by one of his dogs. As the two men approached each other, Presley, closely studying the other, began to wonder where he had seen him before. It must have been a very long time ago, upon one of his previous visits to the ranch. Certainly, however, there was something familiar in the shepherd's face and figure. When they came closer to each other, and Presley could see him more distinctly, this sense of a previous acquaintance was increased and sharpened. The shepherd was a man of about 35. He was very lean and spare. His brown canvas overalls were thrust into laced boots. A cartridge belt without any cartridges encircled his waist. A gray flannel shirt, open at the throat, showed his breast, tanned and ruddy. He wore no hat. His hair was very black and rather long. A pointed beard covered his chin, growing straight and fine from the hollow cheeks. The absence of any covering for his head was, no doubt, habitual with him, for his face was as brown as an Indian's, a ruddy brown, quite different from Presley's dark olive. To Presley's morbidly keen observation, the general impression of the shepherd's face was intensely interesting. It was uncommon to an astonishing degree. Presley's vivid imagination chose to see in it the face of an ascetic, of a recluse, almost that of a young seer. So must have appeared the half-inspired shepherds of the Hebraic legends, the younger prophets of Israel, dwellers in the wilderness, beholders of visions, having their existence in a continual dream, talkers with God, gifted with strange powers. Suddenly, at some 20 paces distant from the approaching shepherd, Presley stopped short, his eyes riveted upon the other. "Vanamee!" he exclaimed. The shepherd smiled and came forward, holding out his hand, saying, "I thought it was you. When I saw you come over the hill, I called you." "But not with your voice," returned Presley. "I knew that someone wanted me. I felt it. I should have remembered that you could do that kind of thing." "I have never known it to fail. It helps with the sheep." "With the sheep?" "In a way. I can't tell exactly how. We don't understand these things yet. There are times when, if I close my eyes and dig my fists into my temples, I can hold the entire herd for perhaps a minute. Perhaps, though, it's imagination. Who knows? But it's good to see you again. How long has it been since the last time? 2, 3, nearly 5 years." It was more than that. It was 6 years since Presley and Vanamee had met, and then it had been for a short time only, during one of the shepherd's periodical brief returns to that part of the country. During a week he and Presley had been much together, for the two were devoted friends. Then, as abruptly, as mysteriously as he had come, Vanamee disappeared. Presley awoke one morning to find him gone. Thus it had been with Vanamee for a period of 16 years. He lived his life in the unknown, one could not tell where, in the desert, in the mountains, throughout all the vast and vague Southwest, solitary, strange. 3, 4, 5 years passed. The shepherd would be almost forgotten. Never the most trivial scrap of information as to his whereabouts reached Los Muertos. He had melted off into the surface shimmer of the desert, into the mirage. He sank below the horizons. He was swallowed up in the waste of sand and sage. Then, without warning, he would reappear, coming in from the wilderness, emerging from the unknown. No one knew him well. In all that countryside he had but 3 friends, Presley, Magnus Derrick, and the priest at the mission of San Juan de Guadalajara, Father Sarria. He remained always a mystery, living a life half real, half legendary. In all those years he did not seem to have grown older by a single day. At this time Presley knew him to be 36 years of age. But since the first day the two had met, the shepherd's face and bearing had, to his eyes, remained the same. At this moment Presley was looking into the same face he had first seen many, many years ago. It was a face stamped with an unspeakable sadness, a deathless grief, the permanent imprint of a tragedy long past, but yet a living issue. Presley told himself that it was impossible to look long into Vanamee's eyes without knowing that here was a man whose whole being had been at one time shattered and riven to its lowest depths, whose life had suddenly stopped at a certain moment of its development. The two friends sat down upon the edge of the watering trough, their eyes wandering incessantly toward the slow-moving herd, grazing on the wheat stubble, moving southward as they grazed. "Where have you come from this time?" Presley had asked. "Where have you kept yourself?" The other swept the horizon to the south and east with a vague gesture. "Off there, down to the south, very far off, so many places that I can't remember. I went the long trail this time, a long, long ways. Arizona, the Mexicos, and then afterwards Utah and Nevada, following the horizon, traveling at hazard. Into Arizona first, going in by Monument Pass, and then on to the south, through the great country of the Navajos, down by the Agathia Needle, a great blade of red rock jutting out from the desert like a knife thrust. Then on and on through the Mexicos, all through the Southwest, then back again in a great circle by Chihuahua and Aldama to Laredo, to Torreon and Albuquerque. From there across the Uncompahgre Plateau into the Uinta country, then at last due west through Nevada to California and to the valley of the San Joaquin. His voice lapsed to a monotone, his eyes becoming fixed. He continued to speak as though half awake, his thoughts elsewhere, seeing again in the eye of his mind the reach of desert and red hill, the purple mountain, the level stretch of alkali, leper white, all the savage, gorgeous desolation of the long trail. He ignored Presley for the moment, but on the other hand, Presley himself gave him but half his attention. The return of Vanamee had stimulated the poet's memory. He recalled the incidents of Vanamee's life, reviewing again that terrible drama which had uprooted his soul, which had driven him forth a wanderer, a shunner of men, a sojourner in waste places. He was, strangely enough, a college graduate and a man of wide reading and great intelligence, but he had chosen to lead his own life, which was that of a recluse. Of a temperament similar in many ways to Presley's, there were capabilities in Vanamee that were not ordinarily to be found in the rank and file of men. Living close to nature, a poet by instinct, where Presley was but a poet by training, there developed in him a great sensitiveness to beauty and an almost abnormal capacity for great happiness and great sorrow. He felt things intensely, deeply. He never forgot. It was when he was 18 or 19, at the formative and most impressionable period of his life, that he had met Angèle Varian. Presley barely remembered her as a girl of 16, beautiful almost beyond expression, who lived with an aged aunt on the seed ranch back of the mission. At this moment he was trying to recall how she looked, with her hair of gold hanging in 2 straight plaits on either side of her face, making 3-cornered her round white forehead. Her wonderful eyes, violet blue, heavy-lidded, with their astonishing upward slant towards the temples, the slant that gave a strange oriental cast to her face, perplexing, enchanting. He remembered the Egyptian fullness of the lips, the strange balancing movement of her head upon her slender neck, the same movement that one sees in a snake at poise. Never had he seen a girl more radiantly beautiful, never a beauty so strange, so troublous, so out of all accepted standards. It was small wonder that Vanamee had loved her, and less wonder still that his love had been so intense, so passionate, so part of himself. Angèle had loved him with a love no less than his own. It was one of those legendary passions that sometimes occur, idyllic, untouched by civilization, spontaneous as the growth of trees, natural as dewfall, strong as the firm-seated mountains. At the time of his meeting with Angèle, Vanamee was living on the Los Muertos ranch. It was there he had chosen to spend one of his college vacations, but he preferred to pass it in out-of-door work, sometimes herding cattle, sometimes pitching hay, sometimes working with pick and dynamite stick on the ditches in the 4th Division of the ranch, riding the range, mending breaks in the wire fences, making himself generally useful. College-bred though he was, the life pleased him. He was, as he desired, close to nature, living the full measure of life, a worker among workers, taking enjoyment in simple pleasures, healthy in mind and body. He believed in an existence passed in this fashion in the country, working hard, eating full, drinking deep, sleeping dreamlessly. But every night, after supper, he saddled his pony and rode over to the garden of the old mission. The adobe dividing wall on that side, which once had separated the mission garden and the seed ranch, had long since crumbled away, and the boundary between the 2 pieces of ground was marked only by a line of venerable pear trees. Here, under these trees, he found Angèle awaiting him, and there the two would sit through the hot, still evening, their arms about each other, watching the moon rise over the foothills, listening to the trickle of the water in the moss-encrusted fountain in the garden, and the steady croak of the great frogs that lived in the damp north corner of the enclosure. Through all one summer the enchantment of that new-found, wonderful love, pure and untainted, filled the lives of each of them with its sweetness. The summer passed, the harvest moon came and went. The nights were very dark. In the deep shade of the pear trees they could no longer see each other. When they met at the rendezvous, Vanamee found her only with his groping hands. They did not speak, mere words were useless between them. Silently, as his reaching hands touched her warm body, he took her in his arms, searching for her lips with his. Then one night the tragedy had suddenly leaped out from the shadow with the abruptness of an explosion. It was impossible afterwards to reconstruct the manner of its occurrence. To Anhele's mind, what there was left of it, the matter always remained a hideous blur, a blot, a vague, terrible confusion. No doubt they too had been watched. The plan succeeded too well for any other supposition. One moonless night, Angele, arriving under the black shadow of the pear trees a little earlier than usual, found the apparently familiar figure waiting for her. All unsuspecting, she gave herself to the embrace of a strange pair of arms, and Vanamee, arriving but a score of moments later, stumbled over her prostrate body, inert and unconscious, in the shadow of the overspiring trees. Who was the other? Angele was carried to her home on the Seed Ranch, delirious, all but raving, and Vanamee, with knife and revolver ready, ranged the countryside like a wolf. He was not alone. The whole county rose, raging, horror-struck. Posse after posse was formed, sent out, and returned without so much as a clue. Upon no one could even the shadow of suspicion be thrown. The other had withdrawn into an impenetrable mystery. There he remained. He never was found. He never was so much as heard of. A legend arose about him, this prowler of the night, this strange, fearful figure with an unseen face, swooping in there from out of the darkness, come and gone in an instant, but leaving behind him a track of terror and death and rage and undying grief. Within the year, in giving birth to the child, Angele had died. The little babe was taken by Angele's parents, and Angele was buried in the mission garden, near to the aged gray sundial. Vanamee stood by during the ceremony, but half conscious of what was going forward. At the last moment he had stepped forward, looked long into the dead face framed in its plaits of gold hair, the hair that made three-cornered the round white forehead, looked again at the closed eyes, with their perplexing upward slant toward the temples, oriental, bizarre, at the lips with their Egyptian fullness, at the sweet, slender neck, the long, slim hands, then abruptly turned about. The last clods were filling the grave at a time when he was already far away, his horse's head turned toward the desert. For 2 years no syllable was heard of him. It was believed that he had killed himself. But Vanamee had no thought of that. For 2 years he wandered through Arizona, living in the desert, in the wilderness, a recluse, a nomad, an ascetic. But doubtless all his heart was in the little coffin in the mission garden. Once in so often he must come back thither. One day he was seen again in the San Joaquin. The priest, Father Soria, returning from a visit to the sick at Bonneville, met him on the upper road. 18 years had passed since Angele had died, but the thread of Vanamee's life had been snapped. Nothing remained now but the tangled ends. He had never forgotten. The long, dull ache, the poignant grief had now become a part of him. Presley knew this to be so. While Presley had been reflecting upon all this, Vanamee had continued to speak. Presley, however, had not been wholly inattentive. While his memory was busy reconstructing the details of the drama of the shepherd's life, another part of his brain had been swiftly registering picture after picture that Vanamee's monotonous flow of words struck off, as it were, upon a steadily moving scroll. The music of the unfamiliar names that occurred in his recital was a stimulant to the poet's imagination. Presley had the poet's passion for expressive, sonorous names. As these came and went in Vanamee's monotonous undertones, like little notes of harmony in a musical progression, he listened, delighted with their resonance. Navajo, Quijotoa, Uinta, Sonora, Laredo, Uncompahgre. To him they were so many symbols. It was his West that passed, unrolling there before the eye of his mind. The open, heat-scourged round of desert, the mesa like a vast altar, shimmering purple in the royal sunset, the still, gigantic mountains heaving into the sky from out the canyons, the strenuous, fierce life of isolated towns, lost and forgotten, down there far off below the horizon. Abruptly his great poem, his Song of the West, leaped up again in his imagination. For the moment he all but held it. It was there close at hand. In another instant he would grasp it. Yes, yes, he exclaimed, I can see it all. The desert, the mountains, all wild, primordial, untamed. How I should have loved to have been with you. Then perhaps I should have got hold of my idea. Your idea? The great poem of the West. It's that which I want to write. Oh, to put it all into hexameters, strike the great iron note, sing the vast, terrible song, the song of the people, the forerunners of empire. Vanamee understood him perfectly. He nodded gravely. Yes, it is there. It is life, the primitive, simple, direct life, passionate, tumultuous. Yes, there is an epic there. Presley caught at the word. It had never before occurred to him. Epic, yes, that's it. It is the epic I'm searching for. And how I search for it. You don't know. It is sometimes almost an agony. Often and often I can feel it right there at my fingertips, but I never quite catch it. It always eludes me. I was born too late. Ah, to get back to that first clear-eyed view of things, to see, as Homer saw, as Beowulf saw, as the Nibelungen poets saw. The life is here, the same as then. The poem is here. My West is here. The primeval, epic life is here, here under our hands, in the desert, in the mountain, on the ranch, all over here, from Winnipeg to Guadalupe. It is the man who is lacking, the poet. We have been educated away from it all. We are out of touch. We are out of tune. Vanamee heard him to the end, his grave, sad face thoughtful and attentive. Then he rose. I am going over to the mission, he said, to see Father Sarria. I have not seen him yet. How about the sheep? The dogs will keep them in hand, and I shall not be gone long. Besides that, I have a boy here to help. He is over yonder on the other side of the herd. We can't see him from here. Presley wondered at the heedlessness of leaving the sheep so slightly guarded, but made no comment, and the two started off across the field in the direction of the mission church. Well, yes, it is there, your epic, observed Vanamee as they went along. But why write? Why not live in it? Steep oneself in the heat of the desert, the glory of the sunset, the blue haze of the mesa and the canyon. As you have done, for instance? Vanamee nodded. No, I could not do that, declared Presley. I want to go back, but not so far as you. I feel that I must compromise. I must find expression. I could not lose myself like that in your desert. When its vastness overwhelmed me, or its beauty dazzled me, or its loneliness weighed down upon me, I should have to record my impressions. Otherwise I should suffocate. Each to his own life, observed Vanamee. The mission of San Juan, built of brown 'dobe blocks covered with yellow plaster that at many points had dropped away from the walls, stood on the crest of a low rise of the ground, facing to the south. A covered colonnade, paved with round, worn bricks, from whence opened the doors of the abandoned cells once used by the monks, adjoined it on the left. The roof was of tiled half-cylinders split longitudinally and laid in alternate rows, now concave, now convex. The main body of the church itself was at right angles to the colonnade, and at the point of intersection rose the belfry tower, an ancient campanile where swung the 3 cracked bells, the gift of the King of Spain. Beyond the church were the mission garden and the graveyard that overlooked the seed ranch in a little hollow beyond. Presley and Vanamee went down the long colonnade to the last door, next the belfry tower, and Vanamee pulled the leather thong that hung from a hole in the door, setting a little bell jangling somewhere in the interior. The place, but for this noise, was shrouded in a Sunday stillness, an absolute repose. Only at intervals one heard the trickle of the unseen fountain and the liquid cooing of doves in the garden. Father Sarria opened the door. He was a small man, somewhat stout, with a smooth and shiny face. He wore a frock coat that was rather dirty, slippers, and an old yachting cap of blue cloth with a broken leather visor. He was smoking a cheap cigar, very fat and black. But instantly he recognized Vanamee. His face went all alight with pleasure and astonishment. It seemed as if he would never have finished shaking both his hands, and as it was he released but one of them, patting him affectionately on the shoulder with the other. He was voluble in his welcome, talking partly in Spanish, partly in English. So he had come back again, this great fellow, tanned as an Indian, lean as an Indian, with an Indian's long black hair. But he had not changed, not in the very least. His beard had not grown an inch. Aha! The rascal, never to give warning, to drop down, as it were, from out the sky. Such a hermit, to live in the desert, a veritable Saint Jerome. Did a lion feed him down there in Arizona, or was it a raven, like Elijah? The good God had not fattened him, at any rate, and apropos, he was just about to dine himself. He had made a salad from his own lettuce. The two would dine with him, eh? For this, my son, that was lost, is found again. But Presley excused himself. Instinctively he felt that Sarria and Vanamee wanted to talk of things concerning which he was an outsider. It was not at all unlikely that Vanamee would spend half the night before the high altar in the church. He took himself away, his mind still busy with Vanamee's extraordinary life and character. But as he descended the hill, he was startled by a prolonged and raucous cry, discordant, very harsh, thrice repeated at exact intervals, and looking up, he saw one of Father Sarria's peacocks balancing himself upon the topmost wire of the fence, his long tail trailing, his neck outstretched, filling the air with this stupid outcry for no reason than the desire to make a noise. About an hour later, toward 4 in the afternoon, Presley reached the spring at the head of the little canyon in the northeast corner of the Quien-Sabe ranch, the point toward which he had been traveling since early in the forenoon. The place was not without its charm. Innumerable live oaks overhung the canyon, and Broderson Creek, there a mere rivulet running down from the spring, gave a certain coolness to the air. It was one of the few spots thereabouts that had survived the dry season of last year. Nearly all the other springs had dried completely, while Mission Creek on Derrick's ranch was nothing better than a dusty cutting in the ground filled with brittle, concave flakes of dried and sun-cracked mud. Presley climbed to the summit of one of the hills, the highest, that rose out of the canyon, from the crest of which he could see for 30, 50, 60 miles down the valley, and, filling his pipe, smoked lazily for upwards of an hour, his head empty of thought, allowing himself to succumb to a pleasant, gentle inanition, a little drowsy, comfortable in this place, prone upon the ground, warmed just enough by such sunlight as filtered through the live oaks, soothed by the good tobacco and the prolonged murmur of the spring and creek. By degrees the sense of his own personality became blunted. The little wheels and cogs of thought moved slower and slower. Consciousness dwindled to a point. The animal in him stretched itself, purring. A delightful numbness invaded his mind and his body. He was not asleep, he was not awake, stupefied merely, lapsing back to the state of the fawn, the satyr. After a while, rousing himself a little, he shifted his position, and drawing from the pocket of his shooting-coat his little tree-calf edition of the Odyssey, read far into the 21st book, where, after the failure of all the suitors to bend Ulysses' bow, is finally put, with mockery, into his own hands. Abruptly, the drama of the story roused him from all his languor. In an instant he was the poet again, his nerves tingling, alive to every sensation, responsive to every impression. The desire of creation, of composition, grew big within him. Hexameters of his own clamored, tumultuous in his brain. Not for a long time had he felt his poem, as he called this sensation, so poignantly. For an instant he told himself that he actually held it. It was, no doubt, Vanamee's talk that had stimulated him to this point. The story of the long trail, with its desert and mountain, its cliff-dwellers, its Aztec ruins, its color, movement, and romance, filled his mind with picture after picture. The epic defiled before his vision like a pageant. Once more he shot a glance about him, as if in search of the inspiration, and this time he all but found it. He rose to his feet, looking out and off below him. As from a pinnacle, Presley, from where he now stood, dominated the entire country. The sun had begun to set. Everything in the range of his vision was overlaid with a sheen of gold. First, close at hand, it was the Seed Ranch, carpeting the little hollow behind the mission with a spread of greens, some dark, some vivid, some pale, almost to yellowness. Beyond that was the mission itself, its venerable campanile, in whose arches hung the Spanish king's bells, already growing ruddy in the sunset. Farther on he could make out Annixter's ranch house, marked by the skeleton-like tower of the artesian well, and a little farther to the east the huddled tiled roofs of Guadalajara. Far to the west and north he saw Bonneville very plain, and the dome of the courthouse a purple silhouette against the glare of the sky. Other points detached themselves, swimming in a golden mist, projecting blue shadows far before them. The mammoth live oak by Hooven's, towering superb and magnificent. The line of eucalyptus trees, behind which he knew was the Los Muertos ranch house, his home. The watering tank, the great iron-hooped tower of wood that stood at the joining of the lower road and the county road. The long windbreak of poplar trees and the white walls of Carahurst Saloon on the county road. But all this seemed to be only foreground, a mere array of accessories, a mass of irrelevant details. Beyond Annixter's, beyond Guadalajara, beyond the lower road, beyond Broderson Creek, on to the south and west, infinite, illimitable, stretching out there under the sheen of the sunset forever and forever, flat, vast, unbroken. A huge scroll, unrolling between the horizons, spread the great stretches of the ranch of Los Muertos, bare of crops, shaved close in the recent harvest. Near at hand were hills, but on that far southern horizon only the curve of the great earth itself checked the view. Adjoining Los Muertos, and widening to the west, opened the Broderson Ranch. The Osterman Ranch, to the northwest, carried on the great sweep of landscape, ranch after ranch. Then, as the imagination itself expanded under the stimulus of that measureless range of vision, even those great ranches resolved themselves into mere foreground, mere accessories, irrelevant details. Beyond the fine line of the horizons, over the curve of the globe, the shoulder of the earth, were other ranches, equally vast, and beyond these others, and beyond these still others, the immensities multiplying, lengthening out vaster and vaster. The whole gigantic sweep of the San Joaquin expanded, titanic, before the eye of the mind, flagellated with heat, quivering and shimmering under the sun's red eye. At long intervals, a faint breath of wind out of the south passed slowly over the levels of the baked and empty earth, accentuating the silence, marking off the stillness. It seemed to exhale from the land itself, a prolonged sigh, as of deep fatigue. It was the season after the harvest, and the great earth, the mother, after its period of reproduction, its pains of labor, delivered of the fruit of its loins, slept the sleep of exhaustion,